When the historian Sallust sought to demonstrate the extent to which the Roman Republic had deteriorated into corruption and greed, he placed a stinging quote in the mouth of Jugurtha, one of Rome's most famous enemies. Commenting on the ease with which the Numidian prince had bribed leading senators to take no action despite his continued flouting of agreements with the Republic, Sallust had Jugurtha mock the venality of the Roman elite and their willingness to sell out the interests of the state for a few gold coins in their pocket. It is said that he often looked back at Rome in silence and finally said, "A city for sale and doomed to speedy destruction if it finds a purchaser." A contemporary of Caesar, Pompey, Cicero, and Cato, Sallust's works focus on how the riches and opportunities for exploitation in Rome's new intercontinental territories increased decadence at home and led to the decline of its republican institutions. By placing this particularly devastating critique in the mouth of a foreigner, an avowed enemy of Rome no less, Sallust was hoping to highlight just how far Rome had fallen from its earlier ideals and neglected a common purpose in the individualistic quest of its elites to accumulate ever more wealth. Sallust was presenting this as a low point, the nadir of Roman civic institutions, and a sign that with the breakdown of civic purpose, civil war was on the horizon. But though Sallust may have wondered how things could possibly get much worse, he would live to see the Republic shatter entirely, and we who study history know that this was just the start. For in 193, 2 centuries after Sallust's death, another act of wanton corruption would again lay bare the real dynamics of power in the transformed Roman state. The position of emperor was about to be auctioned to the highest bidder. Merit had no place here. No appeals were made to the supposed sovereignty of the Roman people. The gods were not consulted. Even a distinguished lineage was not considered. Coin now indisputably ruled in Rome. Gone were the days of the Republic, when any citizen, no matter how insignificant, could cast a vote on the magistrates who would govern. Rome had been fundamentally transformed by Augustus, and though his new order honored republican forms and language, the true power was the princeps, and his authority came not from the consent of the governed, but directly from the army, with the key constituency being the elite praetorian regiments who were stationed in Rome, ostensibly to protect the emperor and his family, but in reality they posed a much greater threat to his safety than any other stakeholder within the Roman state. The praetorians could be loyal, but that loyalty came at a price. With the previous Emperor Pertinax now slain at the hands of the praetorians themselves for reneging on lucrative promises of payment, the ambitious senator Didianus Julianus was about to find out exactly how much the throne cost. Then ensued a most disgraceful business, and one unworthy of Rome, for just as if it had been in some market or auction room, both the city and its entire empire were auctioned off. The sellers were the ones who had slain the emperor, and the would-be buyers were Sulpicianus and Julianus, who vied to outbid each other, one from the inside, the other from the outside. They gradually raised their bids up to 20,000 sesterces per soldier. Some of the soldiers would carry word to Julianus. "Sulpicianus offers so much. How much more do you make it?" And to Sulpicianus in turn, "Julianus promises so much. How much do you raise him?" Sulpicianus would have won the day, being inside and being prefect of the city, and also the first to name the figure 20,000. Had not Julianus raised his bid no longer by a small amount, but by 5,000 at one time, both shouting it in a loud voice and also indicating the amount with his fingers. So the soldiers, captivated by this excessive bid, and at the same time fearing that Sulpicianus might avenge Pertinax, an idea that Julianus put into their heads, received Julianus inside and declared him emperor. Rome had at last found a buyer, and he was doomed to speedy destruction. But Julianus was not the only one in danger. His farcical coronation was little more than an invitation to rebellion across the empire. For the first time in over a century, Rome was plunged into civil war. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. It should come as little surprise that Julianus's reign was short-lived. Though he had won the backing of the Praetorians with his bribe, he also demonstrated to every general in the empire just how easy it was to assume the throne. For over 120 years, Rome had enjoyed peace and prosperity, an era that is synonymous with the height of the supposed Pax Romana, and that actually saw the majority of emperors, dating back to Vespasian, dying of natural causes in their own beds. The successful emperors had passed the throne to their sons, either biological or adopted, creating a chain of legitimacy and discouraging commanders on the frontier from pressing their luck and making a play for the throne. But now, with Julianus circumventing all stakeholders save the Praetorians, every ambitious commander smelled blood in the water. An emperor reigned, but he lacked legitimacy, and there was a vacuum at the heart of the Roman state, unlike any since Nero died without heir in 68. Generals now hoped to emulate the success of Vespasian, who, though born into relatively humble circumstances, had emerged as the ultimate winner of the chaotic civil war of 69 to 70, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Vespasian's triumph had shattered the illusion that the Senate and people played a role in the selection of the princeps, and revealed, in Tacitus's words, the secret of empire. Welcome as the death of Nero had been in the first burst of joy, yet it had not only aroused various emotions in Rome, among the senators, the people, or the soldiery of the capital, it had also excited all the legions and their generals. For now had been divulged that secret of the empire, that emperors could be made elsewhere than at Rome. By nakedly purchasing the throne, Julianus had again removed the veiling effect of Rome's ideological superstructure, composed of tradition, patronage, piety, and honor, that cloaked the imperial position and inspired loyalty. In doing so, the secret of empire was once more laid bare, and he invited challengers, leading to yet another civil war between multiple claimants. From this point forward, armed conflict over the position of emperor was to become depressingly common, leading to a cycle of disorder and illegitimacy that was to plague the empire on and off until it eventually contributed to the crisis of the 3rd century, and a systematic reorganization of the Roman state by Diocletian that was so comprehensive that it is not an overstatement to put it on par with the evolution from republic to empire under Augustus. At the core of this disastrous cycle was the demystification of the imperial position, and the continued inability to legally formalize the succession in such a way that would clearly delineate who was and who wasn't eligible for the throne. This problem persisted because it was a fundamental aspect of the imperial position itself. Augustus had marshaled in a new order centered around his person, but he had been careful to never assume overtly monarchical honors, as Roman political culture held a deeply ingrained opposition to monarchy, dating back to the legendary oath of Brutus after the overthrow of the Tarquins. Thus, despite him accruing all of the powers of a monarch, His position was never codified, and thus the designation of a formal heir was impossible. Though outwardly deferential to the Senate, and presenting himself as nothing more than the first citizen, none would dispute that Augustus sat at an unrivaled and unprecedented position atop Roman politics. But because he could make no monarchical claims, his extraordinary authority was wrapped in the unspoken bonds of patronage, religious devotion, and civic obligation. If these were not enough to compel obedience, Augustus ensured that the vast majority of the legions, including the elite praetorians, were personally loyal to him. So, despite the cloak of tradition he used to mask power, it was always understood that the unique position rested entirely on military dominance. While in theory the collection of roles and responsibilities that combined to form this position were all ratified by the Senate, already by the reign of Tiberius it was becoming clear that the military was the only constituency which mattered, hence the conflation of the battlefield acclamation imperator with the office of the princeps to such a degree that these men are known today as emperors. With the military, and not the Senate or people, as the most influential factor in determining legitimacy, an emperor had to demonstrate sustained martial success, and keep the troops happy by sating them with plunder or gifts from the Roman treasury. Were he unable to provide both, then the threat always existed of a competent regional commander usurping the position. As financial troubles made it difficult for emperors to continue paying the ever-increasing salaries and donatives soldiers had become accustomed to, and foreign incursions necessitated that commanders on multiple fronts be equipped with significant military resources, it is easy to understand how Rome fell into a period of prolonged civil conflict during the latter half of the 3rd century, where each successful general saw an incompetent and unpopular regime that could easily be toppled. But in moving his troops off the front to challenge the current emperor, he only invited further incursions from the outside, contributing to further destabilization. Though he was working within his own constraints and a unique ideological environment, the inability of Augustus to formally codify his position was a ticking time bomb that must be taken into account when we appraise his legacy, as well as that of every other emperor who declined to tackle this thorny issue, and left it to his successors to navigate. That the crisis of the 3rd century unfolded then is not a surprise. What is unusual is that it took so long, and that Rome enjoyed its golden Pax Romana at all, in spite of the flimsy edifice upon which its dominion rested. That the legions were active during this era of supposed peace and prosperity is beyond dispute, and it is my contention that it was the continual war and conquest outside the limits of the empire during this period of peace that allowed for Rome to continue neglecting its core problems. Plunder of outsiders and exploitation of the provinces provided just enough money to keep everyone satisfied, and for the emperors to indulge their prodigious appetites for luxury while also keeping the army well paid. Rome was theoretically at peace during the Pax Romana, yet it was still waging war on a massive scale. Roman affluence had been purchased through provincial suffering and misery. The Augustan poet and propagandist Virgil declared that Jupiter had offered the Romans an empire without limit, yet even Rome could not expand forever. There were real logistical and even communication barriers to continued growth, and the further it pushed, the more the tribes, nations, and kingdoms that surrounded Rome pushed back. Already under Hadrian, there was a recognition that Rome's borders were becoming indefensible, with a crucial factor in this consideration being an unwillingness to entrust frontier commanders with the military resources they might need to hold territories won by Trajan, as these legions could just as soon be marching on Rome as they could on Ctesiphon. This danger necessitated that Rome do the unthinkable: give up territory and consolidate along defensible borders. This new policy and lull in aggression allowed Rome's foes to rebuild, and cracks in the facade were already appearing even under Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who is much admired today but whose accomplishments fail to measure up to his popular reputation. However, fortunately for the Romans, his reign wasn't as bad as his philosophy, and his campaigns on the Danube staved off crisis for a generation. But, often overlooked by those who consider Aurelius's military exploits, is the fact that the emperor need be present at all. Marcus Aurelius was not a soldier. He was much more at home writing Stoic drivel than at the head of a legion. But, like his immediate predecessors, he knew that any army capable of waging war successfully was too large to be left in any hands but his own. So, like Hadrian, Aurelius would spend over half his reign outside Italy. Contrast the necessity of this direct supervision in the 2nd century with Augustus's tenure as princeps, where he was able to delegate command and thus oversee political life in Rome. It may not have been recognizable at the time, but this drift away from Rome and the Senate as the political center of the empire in favor of wherever the largest army was congregated represented a transformation in the power dynamics of the Roman state. It also explains why the Eternal City itself became less and less important over time. But though these forces were coming to a head, Rome was still strong enough, stable enough, and rich enough that it remained prosperous and secure even during the lackluster reign of Aurelius's son and chosen successor Commodus. Though Rome itself was safe, Commodus was not, and his erratic behavior resulted in his assassination and the elevation of Pertinax in 193. Commodus was the first emperor to die violently in nearly 100 years. But Pertinax would follow in his footsteps only a few months later. While generals on the frontier had been content with the elevation of the respected Pertinax, they bore no such loyalty for his successor Julianus, especially once the terms of his selection came to light. Julianus's bribes had bought the Praetorian Guard, but not all of the legions. Roman warlords in Britain, Pannonia, and the East all rose to claim the throne for themselves. If Julianus could buy the throne, they saw no reason why they couldn't as well. Besides, bribes are much easier to pay when you are using public money instead of your own. The ensuing civil war lasted for 4 years, and resulted in the ultimate victory of Septimius Severus, whose battle-hardened Danube legions made it possible for him to found the Severan dynasty. He was a competent ruler who positioned his sons for success as his heirs, while also showing the foresight to disband the untrustworthy Praetorian Guard. But, though rid of the treacherous Praetorians, nothing about the material forces that drove the army to periodic revolt or encouraged it to extort the state for ever higher wages was fundamentally addressed. Severus had treated the symptom, not the disease. He seemed aware of this when, on his deathbed in 211, he prepared to make his sons Caracalla and Geta co-emperors, telling them, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." He knew that the army alone had the power to dislodge them from the throne, and that it could only be placated through bribery. But his realpolitik advice was neglected. The brothers were soon at odds, and Caracalla had Geta slain in their own mother's arms. Soon, Caracalla would meet a similar end, assassinated in a conspiracy orchestrated by Macrinus. It would be roughly 100 years before another emperor clearly died of natural causes, like their father Septimius Severus. The crisis was here. The doom prophesied by Jugurtha may not have arrived as quickly as he expected, but with the rise of the soldier emperors, it was now inevitable.